There's a great part of Hamlet early in the play. There's a character called Polonius who's advising his son. His son, Laertes, is going overseas. And Polonius quite famously says to Laertes, after the end of all this advice, he says, "This above all else, to thine own self be true." And that was the core of the advice. And if I can be arrogant enough to give advice to my fellow introverts, it would be embrace the introversion, follow that passion, have those really deep relationships, and really enjoy the process. And it's more than okay. It's the way to live.
Hello, and welcome to episode 104 of the Quiet and Strong podcast, especially for introverts. I'm your host, David Hall, and the creator of quietandstrong.com. It's a weekly podcast dedicated to understanding the strengths and needs of introverts. Introversion is not something to fix, but to be embraced. Normally, we'll air each episode on a Monday. Be sure to subscribe on your favorite platform. Leave a review. That would mean a lot to me. Tell a friend about the podcast. Help get the word out there. Peter Anthony is an author, speaker, and has a master's in professional communication, and all that as an introvert. As an expert in collaboration and commercial relationship development, Peter has run workshops for thousands of people in 12 countries over 20 years. He consults with Fortune 500 companies to help them achieve better, smarter outcomes from more effective internal and external relationships. His book, Collabradabra, highlights the 6 moments that matter to maximize collaborative outcomes, one conversation at a time. All right. I'm excited for my guest, Peter. Peter, welcome to the Quiet and Strong podcast.
G'day, David, and hello, listeners from Sydney, Australia.
All right. Peter, we're going to get into the great work you do around collaboration and influence, but we're definitely going to talk about your journey as discovering you're an introvert, but now you help other people with communication and improving their influence and collaboration. Tell us about that.
Yeah, David, I didn't discover I was an introvert. I knew I was one. I was a boy. I was probably like 4 or 5 or 6 years old, and I used to love just being in my room reading. I was a huge reader. And my mother came from a huge family. She had lots of brothers, and on Sundays she'd invite all her brothers or my uncles over with their children. They had big families. And I just did not like being around that many people. I would be in my room reading my book. And my mother was encouraging me constantly to get out of my room and talk to my uncles and my cousins and all my family members. And sure enough, one day I finally came out and my mum said, look, just ask your Uncle Harry some questions. Just ask him how he is. Ask him about his life as a lumberjack. And I came out of my room. I just asked Uncle Harry a question, and he just kept telling me stories for like an hour. And I thought, maybe this is part of the secret sauce I need. All I've got to do is come out of my room, if you like, come out of my introversion and just ask questions. And I just found for many years, from like when I was 5 till I was probably in my early teens, I would just, when I had to meet people, I would just ask them questions and they would give me answers. So I would learn things. They would like me because I asked questions, and they'd rarely ask me a question back, which I really liked, because they could just talk about themselves and I could just listen. And I learned things. I met different people, and that was the beginning of the journey, if you like. Just learning to ask questions. That was the first seed that got sown for me.
Okay. So you always knew you were an introvert. Were there things over the course of your life that you had to learn to do as an introvert, like the things that you needed, or it sounds like you learned to connect with people in a good way, but was there other things that you had to learn to be successful as an introvert?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. When I first, I went to university or college, as you call it, and that was easy because studying as an introvert is really easy. In fact, the more introverted you are, the more you can study. I found that was because I didn't get distracted by social events and drinking and all the normal campus activities. And then I got out of college, out of university, and I had to. I was in roles where I needed to deal with clients, and I was taught selling at a fairly early age, and I really didn't like it at all. It felt really structured. It felt really contrived, and what I found was the less I did it, the more the clients engage with me. So I had to find a way of managing those business and client relationships and not use what I was told, because what I was told and what I was taught quite strongly was if you want to engage in a client relationship or a business relationship, you need to sell things to people. And I found that just did not work. In fact, the opposite worked for me.
Yeah. So what were those traditional approaches? And probably they're still used quite widely. Why didn't they work? And when we're saying sales, somebody listening might be in a sales role, or they might be in any role where there's still some aspect of selling, so to speak. What did you find wrong with the traditional approaches?
Well, what I found wrong was firstly, I found it was very contrived and very structured. You had like a structured series of questions to ask. You had particular closing techniques to use. I didn't like the structure. I didn't like the fact that it was all about what I wanted or what the company wanted and not about what the other person may need. And I found that whenever I started selling or making recommendations, there'd be a distance in the relationship. I'd feel like people were stepping away and getting cynical with me and what I was suggesting. And for quite a while, that was very challenging, because that was, no matter where you are in an organization, you think, well, you're selling something to somebody, even if it's an internal role, you're selling a service to somebody, like you've got internal stakeholders potentially, or external customers, or internal customers for what you're doing. And I found that a real struggle. And what I found was that the more I understood what that person was looking for, and the more I collaborated with them in getting their outcome, I would get more of what I wanted. So I almost turned selling on its head. I did the opposite. Like, rather than closing sales, I was opening relationships. And I found that took a little bit longer, but it worked better and it lasted longer, because I was building relationships as opposed to selling a product or a service. So that was a huge switch in my mind, if you like. That was probably my early 20s, mid-20s.
Definitely on this show, we talk about the strengths and needs of introverts. We talk about some strategies for success, which we'll get into all that. We also bust some myths. And one right there, we're talking about building relationships. Often a myth I hear is introverts don't like people. And of course, we know that's kind of silly. We need people, we need connections. How is it different building relationships as an introvert?
Oh, it's very different, David. And I've had the good fortune since then to, in my coaching practice, to work a lot on psychometrics and understand the sort of traits that make introverts successful. And one huge difference is that introverts like me will tend to have fewer relationships, but they'll be deeper. Whereas extroverts tend to have more relationships, but they're more shallow. I guess it's almost a difference between, say, an online dating service, which is all about swiping left and swiping right, having like a lot of very shallow relationships, to something where you're interested in having less relationships and making them more meaningful. So I think, and that's definitely a superpower. It's been a superpower of mine in my business practice, because what I look for is having fewer, bigger clients and having closer relationships with them. It also works in my personal life, because I don't like having 100 friends. I mean, I use, I guess, Facebook friends as a way of staying in contact with people that are geographically remote from me. But I like friends. I like less friends. I like less commercial relationships, but deeper. So that's definitely a strength. And initially, I thought that wasn't great, because there is almost like an assumption in the world that to be successful, you need to be extroverted. To be out there talking the talk. But in fact, I believe the opposite's true. And if you look at the most successful entrepreneur in the world as we speak, that's Elon Musk. He wrote PayPal with his brother. He started SpaceX. He started Tesla, started the Boring Company, started Neuralink, and just recently purchased Twitter. He's likely to be, as we speak, the most successful person in the world in a commercial sense. and he's a self-confessed introvert. He's my introvert hero.
Yeah, and I would say his success is because he's a deep thinker. He's thinking of all
Yes,
these
exactly.
ideas, and it's because he's an introvert that he enjoys great success. But as you're saying, it's a common thing with introverts. We do have a tighter circle of friends, and sometimes we're made to feel like there's something wrong with that, but there absolutely isn't. We want to go deeper and not have lots of shallow relationships. And we might have lots of acquaintances and things, but we definitely want those deep friendships for sure. And it's normal, right?
Yeah, absolutely, and I think it helps too in terms of romantic relationships and parenting. I mean, I'm a parent of 5 children, a dad to 5 children, and I find that having a deeper relationship with them, particularly with my wife, for example, it makes the relationship more meaningful than having a more shallow one on the surface. I think right across the board, and if you look at the good positive psychology now, like the work of people like Martin Seligman and others that have built this whole positive psychology genre, their research suggests that the number one marker for happiness in people, like self-reported happiness, is the quality and depth of the relationships. So you would expect in that case for the introverts to be happier than the extroverts. And I'm careful when I say this too, because as we mentioned earlier before we jumped on the podcast, David, there isn't like an introvert. There's different versions of introverts. It's a broad group of people, so it's hard to say, well, this is all introverts are like this, because there's different varieties.
Yeah, and that's the thing. We're complex as human beings, and there's more to our personalities than introversion, extroversion. I happen to do this podcast because I think there's really significant differences between, general differences between introverts and extroverts that are still very misunderstood. There's a lot more that we can learn about each other. You mentioned one strength. Is there any other superpowers for yourself or other introverts that you've worked with?
Yeah, absolutely. There's several superpowers. Another superpower that I alluded to when I talked about asking questions is that introverts are better listeners. They're better at asking questions and better at listening to the answers because they pay attention more to what's being said, because they're more observing. If you look at a classic character trait of an introvert, one of the three big character traits is observing. Like, you're observing what's happening around you. You're listening to what's being said. So they're great listeners, which makes them great influencers, because if you think about what Stephen Covey suggested when he said, seek first to understand before seeking to be understood, introverts understand better. So then they can go ahead and make better recommendations because they understand the needs of the person that they're talking to. Introverts like me also are better at recharging. I mean, I'll have to recharge after we do this podcast. I have some downtime.
Me too.
And that recharging makes you fresher, makes you clearer. It's a little like when I travel, I like to collect snow cones. So those little things you shake up and there's snow in them. Like, I've got ones from all over the US, like little Eiffel Towers, little Empire State Buildings. You shake it up and then all the snow settles. What I find is when I'm recharging, all the snow settles and I can see things more clearly. Much better at recharging. We've talked about relationships, but also I find introverts like myself and like many that I've worked with over the last 20 years is that they have a huge amount of passion for less things. I remember I was working with a big mining company recently, and it's headed up by geologists and scientists. And there's one geologist I was coaching. We were talking about what she was doing in downtime. I said, so what do you do in your downtime? And she said, I just like going home and hanging out with my rocks. I've always loved rocks since I was a kid. She talked about this place in her garage is full of rocks. Like, this is really cool. Like, she's a geologist and she just loves imagining like rocks under the ground and where there could be seams of coal or seams of iron ore or where the gas is. And she imagines all this sort of underground world, and she loves hanging out with. And she is one of the best geologists in the world because she's really passionate about her geology. and she has been her entire life. And I really love that about introverts because they tend to be really into what they're into, really passionate about it, and they get like an inch wide and a mile deep, which I really love. And that's the sort of expertise we need.
Exactly.
You don't want surface level expertise in things. And I was even watching. I mean, one of the bizarre things one of my daughters and I like doing is we like watching these unsolved murder shows where they have like a murder that's happened like 10 years ago, and they bring all these experts in to try and fix it, to try and solve it. And there's one particular murder that this expert they couldn't solve it because they found these particular sort of markings on a piece of steel, and they found this expert that spent his life studying markings on steel and what makes markings on steel. Of course, an introvert, he spent all his time studying markings on steel, which is great. He helped solve the crime, which is really cool. I mean, so I think that recharging is definitely a strength. I think like deep passion for what you're doing is a huge strength. Listening is a huge strength, like listening to what people are saying, and also the depth of relationships. They're huge strengths, and they're huge strengths that extroverts don't get anywhere near.
I was watching one of your videos, and so I was definitely going to ask you about the passion because that really stuck out to me because I know that that's the case for me. What the work I do, whether it be on this podcast or other things, that's what drives me. And sometimes people are even surprised, like, wait, you're an introvert. How can you get so passionate about something? I'm like, well, obviously you don't understand introversion because, so just talk just a little bit more about that. Like, how does it drive us to do what we do?
The passion, yeah. I think what it is I think, and this gets back to the positive psychology approach to introversion. It's that I believe we are hardwired to feel good by doing well, and the more we accept who we are and we express who we are, the happier we're going to be. Because I remember when I first studied psychology, there was a beautiful phrase from Carl Jung, and he said that there's an inner self that's beckoning you on a call to adventure. And only you know what that adventure is. So when you tap into that, as we do when we spend our time alone and we recharge, we're tapping into what we really love and what we really like. We get deep into it. That's what makes us really happy, because we are most expressing ourselves. And I think when introverts are unhappy, I think it's because we don't tend to be as optimistic as the extroverts are. Extroverts are a lot more optimistic about things, whereas introverts are a little more risk averse and a little more pessimistic, or not quite as optimistic. So it makes us appear as if we're not as happy as the extroverts. And that's the only area I would suggest as an introvert that introverts we need to think about. That's our optimism, because we don't tend to be naturally as optimistic as the extroverts are.
Yeah. And with what you were saying is sometimes, and I know that this was the case for me for far too long, where I was trying to be something I wasn't. And so maybe I wasn't pursuing my passion like I should. But when I really got to know who I was and did pursue those things I was passionate about, that's how my passion really drives me, is by being authentic to myself.
Yeah, being authentic and being happy in yourself. The only trouble is, which I found when I was a teenager in my early 20s, was meeting a romantic partner, because the women I was meeting were extroverts. I remember one person who I really liked and really cared for, but she wanted to be with me all the time. And I said, I found that exhausting. Just, I can't do this.
Yeah.
And we ended up splitting up, unfortunately, because I just could not handle that level of companionship. I needed the recharging bit. But then I think that's what Shakespeare said too in Hamlet. There's a great part of Hamlet early in the play. There's a character called Polonius who's advising his son, because his son Laertes is going overseas. And Polonius quite famously says to Laertes, after the end of all this advice, he says, "This above all else, to thine own self be true. And that was the core of the advice. And if I can be arrogant enough to give advice to my fellow introverts, it would be embrace the introversion, follow that passion, have those really deep relationships, and really enjoy the process. And it's more than okay. It's the way to live.
Well said. That's brilliant. That's what this is all about. Let's get into your book, Collabradabra.
Yeah.
Tell us about the book, what it's about, what caused you to write it.
Well, I guess it echoes back to what we talked about earlier, David. We when I realized selling wasn't working, I spent 15 years in big advertising agencies, helping make television commercials for big brands. And I moved into consulting. And again, it was all about sales. And I thought, this isn't working. What does work? And I began developing this idea of collaborative conversations. And I thought, there's a magic in collaborating for us introverts. And I thought, abracadabra, collaboration, Collabradabra, the magic of collaborative conversations. And I went back to university or to college. I did a master's degree in communication and studied this very closely. And I developed through working with people in workshops, like in like thousands of people in 12 different countries, primarily introverts I was working with. I'd say 80% of the people in my programs were introverts. I developed this collaborative approach to having conversations. So you're collaborating, which means you're getting your outcome, they're getting their outcome, and ideally there's a pro-social outcome as well, hence the magic part. It's not about selling something, like me taking something from you or giving you something you don't really need. It's a matter of us both achieving something more together than we could separately. That was along with, I looked at the work of people like Eleanor Ostrom, who was the last woman to win a Nobel Prize for economics. She got her Nobel Prize for pro-social collaboration. Looked at the work of Rachel Botsman, who predicted the rise of Airbnb and Uber through the collaborative economy, because she said, look, taxis just aren't understanding what consumers are looking for, what passengers are looking for. And in that spirit, I developed and wrote Collabradabra, which is the book of the workshops that I run. It follows the process. And that's where it came from. That's where it came from. It took several years. I didn't just sit down like a genius and write it all. It took me a while.
Yeah.
And I kept trialing it. I kept trialing it in workshops, because I was running workshops, and in the programs I said, bring along your most difficult clients, your most difficult conversations, and let's literally workshop them. And I developed the approach for the clients that I was working with. So they got their fingerprints all over it. And the book's full of stories about clients and their experiences and their conversations that I learned over that period of time.
A lot of people are trying to do something that doesn't work, or maybe you might call that the traditional approach. So along with that, how do introverts learn to have more influence?
Well, that's how they have more influence. I'd say it begins with three intentions, which are easy for introverts to have. Obviously, the first is having a collaborative intention, like deliberately, obviously, publicly be a collaborator. So I'm very keen to collaborate with you, David, to achieve great outcomes that we can have together. Authenticity, like embracing the introversion, being an authentic introvert. And be optimistic, which is particularly true for us because, as I mentioned earlier, we tend to be a little more realistic or pessimistic than our more extroverted colleagues. They're the three intentions or mindsets to be thinking about. Then I have 6 moments that matter in these conversations. And would you like to talk about those?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. Well, the first of those moments takes place before the conversation takes place. And that's a moment which is about setting an outcome or thinking about the goal of the conversation, because you're looking towards leaving the people better off after a conversation with you than they were when it started. So you're asking yourself, what's going to be different about how they're thinking, how they're feeling, or what they're doing in a beneficial way than how the conversation started. So if you think about the feeling, it might be, I'd like them to feel more comfortable with me, more confident with me. I like them to feel like I'm someone they can trust. So it could be a feeling goal. It could be a thinking goal. You'd like to change how they're thinking about something that you'd like to suggest or recommend. Or it could be changing a behavioral goal, changing what they're doing. Maybe they're following a process or a procedure that you could recommend a change would be beneficial to them. So you're thinking about that first, and that's where it starts and where the conversation is going to begin. And also, you're looking at developing a commitment curve. So over a series of conversations, you're developing a relationship. And all the good research on relationships says the quality of relationships is the quality of the conversations. Even the work of John Gottman at Washington State University in romantic relationships, he content analyzes how couples talk to each other, and he can predict whether the couple will stay together or not based on just on the conversation. It's really quite extraordinary. So you've got the goal first. Then you're meeting, you get the face-to-face part, and you begin relating. And what we like to talk about in Collabradabra is you listen until you disappear, which is easy for introverts. We like disappearing. So we are just fully immersing ourselves in the other person, like giving them all of our attention. And what the good research suggests is that when people feel like they've got your full attention, and you adjust your style to suit theirs, they're much more willing and able to adjust their thinking to suit yours. And that continues. So you give them your full attention. The third step is taking the lead or giving the conversation some structure. And you're answering 4 primary questions the other person has, which is, why is the conversation taking place? What outcome are we looking towards achieving together? How do we plan to get there in the structure of the conversation? And so what's next? So how does this fit into an overall relationship, a commercial relationship that you and I are having? So you might say, like if I was having a conversation with you, David, like I am now, I might say, look, David, let's have the reason we're having this conversation is that we want to share some ideas on how introverts can maximize their potential. The way I thought we could do this is you could ask me some questions about my experience with introverts. I could give you my ideas and perspectives. Then the listeners may achieve some outcomes. How does that sound? That sounds terrific. So then we can create something that will be really worthwhile and make a contribution to introverts. So I'm giving the conversation some structure. And then we get into step or moment 4. I think up to 4.
Yeah, I think so.
Moment 4, and it could only be a minute in at this stage. And introverts love this. It's all about questions, not about talking, about asking questions. And you want to understand, like if you think about that goal we talked about earlier, you're attempting to influence a decision. Like if you're influencing somebody, you're attempting to change a decision that they're making or influence a decision they're making. So before you can influence a decision, you've got to understand, well, how do they make decisions now? And you think, well, you need to ask questions about what sort of criteria they're using, which is the first part. Like I said, say, David, when you're thinking about buying a new washing machine or a new car or a new conveyor belt system or a new truck, what sort of things are important to you? So I get your criteria. Then I'm going to ask what order they're in from top to bottom, because often introverts will give the most important one last, and extroverts put the most important one first. Then you'll say, hey, what does that mean? Like just say, for example, I'm selling a new software system to you. And you might say, look, the most important thing to us is security. And because I think Euro-linguistically, I'm going to think security means what my definition is. You could have quite a different definition. So I might say, what does security mean to you? Like, what does that mean? Or you might say, cost effectiveness. So I'm really curious, David, what does cost effectiveness mean for you? So I'm getting the meaning part. And the final thing we need to understand is, or questions we're asking is about, like, what should we do most to avoid here? And what do we want to avoid the most? Because often people will do more to avoid something than gain something, like avoid a mistake, particularly us introverts, avoiding mistakes, avoiding problems. We want to know those things. And then we package that up, like what the criteria are, what order they're in, what they mean, what we should do most to avoid. And then we can then make a recommendation based on their criteria. We're not making recommendation I like, because maybe the recommendation is that we don't proceed. I mean, often when I'm working with clients, I'm looking towards talking them out of working with me, which is really crazy, because I don't want to work with people where it won't work, because my biggest sales team is my clients. So I want it to work. I don't want it to not work. I don't want to get flown to somewhere and run workshops in different countries and it not work. That's very embarrassing and it's bad for business. So for my sake, I want it to work. So I'll make a recommendation, ideally based on their criteria, or maybe I might need to change one of their criteria because maybe they don't know. There's some thinking or some research or some approaches they're not aware of. Because often, if you're recommending something, you're working in that space all the time, but they may not know as much as you. You, particularly an introvert, you're likely to know it a lot better than they do because you're going to drill right down into things. So you make your recommendation, and finally you reach an agreement, which might be a yes, let's proceed. It might be a no, which I really like. I like no's because I think too many of us spend too much time pretending things are going to proceed when we both know they're not going to proceed. Well, there could be a maybe. And if it's a maybe, there's a simple negotiating process we can take where we both end up better off. And all the way through, we carry those same intentions. We carry through the collaboration, we carry through the authenticity, and we carry through the optimism. Optimism is, hey, you and I can have conversations and we can both be better off and build a relationship and enjoy the process. And what a beautiful way to be hanging out, just doing that. Does that make sense? It's like a whole thing in a very small nutshell.
Yeah, I love it. And it's such a good point. It's, too often if you're just trying to get me to do something for your benefit, it's not going to work for me. I'm going to want to take the approach like you're describing where it works for both of us. And that just really
absolutely
pays off.
And it tends to work. I mentioned earlier, David, that most of the people I work with are introvert, particularly technical professionals. And it tends to work better for them because they're never selling in this approach. It's always about a relationship with the other person and they get to go first. So you're spending most of your time asking questions. Like in a 90-minute conversation, you're spending, say, 80 minutes of it asking questions, which is more comfortable for us. And that's why I like the approach, because it's mainly question-driven, not statement-driven.
Yeah. And we're thinking, right? So I know that is my approach as well. I am going to ask people lots of questions because I'm trying to get to know them and what they need, just like you're describing. And I think as introverts, we can be very good at that.
Yeah, and we're a lot more curious, so we're better at asking questions. We like to go deeper into something. And the other part of recommendations, I think it's important for us fellow introverts to remember is when you're making recommendations that are like presentations, it's useful if there's stories as opposed to PowerPoint decks. Because the beauty I find with stories, like in making a pitch or making a recommendation, is that there's this part of a story which is called narrative transportation. And the best way I can describe it is if you're watching a movie, a really good movie, you get transported into the movie and feel like you're part of it in a bizarre sort of way. Like you could be in a cinema watching a movie or at home watching Netflix. And if you're watching, like the last great movie I watched was the latest Top Gun movie with Tom Cruise. I felt the thrill of being in those jets. You feel a bit scared and a bit anxious because you can see these guys flying. So when you tell a good story to somebody, they get transported into the story. So it takes the attention off you. That's why I like a storytelling approach to making presentations, because it takes the pressure off me. They get transported into the story and their belief gets suspended. So then I can make recommendations which they could be happier with if they trust me, if I've got an authentic relationship, and if they believe I'd like to make us both better off. I've got that collaborative spirit. I'll get engaged in the story. So I'd also recommend storytelling, like strategic commercial storytelling for us introverts too, rather than using a PowerPoint deck, which I hate.
Yeah, stories are powerful. And what does make a good story?
What makes a good story is to remember that the core. If you think of any great movie that you've seen, you think What can we learn from that, or any great story? They're all the same. You get introduced to a hero that you like in the movie or in the show, and that hero wants something that they've got a desire. Like in the Top Gun case, Tom Cruise wanted to be relevant again and embrace America and look at that whole freedom idea, which was terrific. But something was getting in his way. In his case, he was getting older and he was getting less relevant. He was flying a plane that was older than the current technology. So there's something the hero wants, but they can't have it. And then the story becomes how they get what they want after a series of challenges. Then, okay, that's the structure of stories. How do I do that? How I do that is I make my client, my customer, the hero of the story. Okay, so you're looking for something, David. You're looking for X, whatever X might be, but there's a reason you can't have it or you're not getting it. Like, here's what you want. Here's why you want it. But there's a reason why you haven't made a decision yet. You can't get it. Then I introduce my approach or what I'm recommending as part of that solution for you. So I understand you. Like if you look at like I do at the exit research of what clients and customers look for in commercial relationships, the number one thing they're looking for is someone with a unique understanding of their needs and their environment. So people you're working with, they want you to uniquely understand their needs and their environment. So I'm saying, I understand you, David. Here's what you're looking for. Here's why you want that, but here's why you're not getting or haven't got it so far. So let's tell a story or use a story as a way of helping David overcome the obstacles he has between what he wants and why he can't have it, and then get him the desired outcome. That's how the story works. And they always begin the same way. So ideally, the customer or the other person is the center of the story. Sometimes it could be the customer's customer. Like I've done a lot of work with big retailers, for example, and they're talking about shoppers coming into stores. So what is that shopper looking for? And how do we improve that shopping or buying experience? But it's the same for everything: photocopiers, cars, shops, mining equipment. It's all the same because it's human beings.
So you're making them the hero. And the other piece of that is you're not the hero, right?
You're never the hero. And that's why introverts make great storytellers, because extroverts, the hero is always them.
Right,
and
right.
I know some very famous, who I won't name, some very famous extroverts that are in leadership positions or potential leadership positions in America. And whenever you hear them talking, it's always about themselves.
Right, right. Okay, so here's the other question about storytelling. Can an introvert, how can they improve their storytelling? And I know that sometimes we may have more beautiful stories in our rich imaginations, but we may struggle to get those out. How can we improve in being a better storyteller as an introvert if we're not already?
Well, I challenge whether we are great storytellers, because I think we are, but for some strange reason, in our personal lives, we tend to listen to and tell stories. Like when we meet with friends or we catch up, we're telling stories to each other, and we're watching stories like in movies and Netflix shows. But when we get to work, we feel like, the story part shuts down, and that we don't communicate that way. So step one is, I'd say, embrace the fact that stories are the best communication tool to transfer an idea. In fact, before like the 1700s, the only way we transferred ideas to each other was by way of stories. I read an interesting book recently on the evolution of the brain, and they talked about stories. And they said they've recently looked at these caves, like where pictures are painted inside caves, like pictures of mooses or animals and bisons and all these sorts of things. And they found the pictures inside caves were drawn in parts where the cave echoed the most, because there were people in the cave telling the story about what these pictures were. It's like an ancient movie they're watching. Hey, here's the picture, I'm going to tell you the story. And they drew those in the parts of the cave that echoed the most, because it gave it the most drama. So I'd say, number one, embrace the fact that stories are the best way to communicate ideas. Number two, think about that structure I just told you, which is the structure of who's the hero, What do they want, which is question number 2, and why can't they have it, which is question number 3. So who are they, what do they want, and why can't they have it? And then what is it about what you're suggesting or offering or talking about, which is part of the solution for them? If you haven't got that, you haven't got a story. And if you can't make a recommendation that works off better for them, you shouldn't be talking to them, because they're not a prospective business partner or relationship for you. Then practice telling stories. And what I do, and I wish I could show it to you. I could give you the evidence of it right in front of me. I keep a storytelling journal, and I write down. I've got like a couple of hundred of them in the back of my binder that I'm running workshops and coaching. And I write down stories, other people's stories I hear, stories I've told that worked, stories I watch, and I write them down, and I access them again and tell those stories. Because I know in my workshops, I ask people, I bump into people all the time that I've been in workshops that I've run, and they say, Peter, I'll never forget the story of X. And they'll tell me the story that I told. They'll forget what I said, but remember the story. So embrace stories, as you know, are a great communication tool. Keep a storytelling journal and practice telling stories. Just practice it. And you're either at the beginning of presentations or the entire presentation. Watch how much more influential you'll be. People will lean into the story. I notice they lean in more when I'm telling a story. And if I get PowerPoint, they lean back. And I suggest use as little PowerPoint as possible.
Yeah, I think that was all such great advice, because sometimes people might think that, stories isn't part of this, but like you said, it's so important. And I love the idea of capturing those stories. Part of this podcast, I learn other people's stories, which I love. And, I've learned some stories from you today, which, I will remember. But I know I could do a better job of capturing the different things that happened to me, but also that happened to other people. So that is great advice.
If you look at the great leaders like I have and how they communicate ideas, they communicate ideas in stories. We mentioned Elon Musk earlier. I mean, when he was starting the Boring Company, and he was looking for investors in the Boring Company to build tunnels under Los Angeles. He was at a huge investment conference, and they said, "Tell us about the Boring Company." And he said, "Look, you've got to think about it like this." He said, "There's a snail in SpongeBob SquarePants that my kids really love watching that show." And I've got that snail or an image of that snail in my office. And the interviewer said, "Why?" And he said, "Because the fastest boring machines travel slower than the fastest snail. So my mission at the Boring Company is to make our boring machines go faster than a snail." And that was an awesome metaphor and a great story, because it just stayed with you. You think, wow, here's this technological genius, happens to be an introvert too, that's pitching a whole business idea using the story of a snail, which is quite extraordinary. That just stuck with me. I thought, this is beautiful the way there's. And if you listen to any of the great communicators, the great leaders, they'll talk in analogies, they'll talk in stories. They'll rarely talk with a direct set of facts, and they'll never pull out a PowerPoint presentation. And the reason they're at the top is that's how they communicate. Introverts, extroverts, the same. Mark Zuckerberg does the same. Another self-confessed introvert, he does the same. He talks in metaphors and in stories. J.K. Rowling, wrote Harry Potter books. How much imagination is in those books? She's an introvert, full of stories. Right. Meryl Streep, one of the best actors of all time, one of the best actors of all time. She spends her life using movies to tell stories. So there's no excuse for us introverts not telling great stories.
For some reason, I think some people think that their stories don't want to be heard, or whatever misconception they got off on. So this is such a great reminder that it is what is impactful, and we need to do that and not give the boring PowerPoint.
Exactly. And if you think about, I think, I believe, and I know from the psychometric research that we, and by we I mean us introverts, we are less optimistic than our extroverted colleagues. And if you think about, if I can give you, I guess, one last tip or one last piece of advice, your optimism is an explanatory style. It's a way that you explain things to yourself and others, and that's acquired. It's not innate. It's not in your DNA. You learned how to explain things to yourself and others. And there's three key questions that you ask as an introvert, or as an extrovert too, but particularly as an introvert, about when bad events happen or are likely to happen. You think, how long will it last? What else gets affected? And who's in charge? And us introverts are likely to think, when bad events happen, they're going to last a bit longer, they're going to affect a bit more, and I'm not in charge. It's being done to me or around me. So if you want to think about becoming a bit more optimistic as an introvert, think, well, when these bad events happen, or they're likely to happen, or I think they may happen, I'm going to try and limit their impact. They don't affect that much. I'm going to try and shorten the time, and I'm going to realize that I'm always in charge of how I think. And there's always a gap between what happens in my life and how I respond to it. And in that gap is your freedom as an introvert to make more optimistic choices and get more of the life that you deserve. And that's just not my ideas. If you want to check this out, look at the work of a guy called Martin Seligman, Seligman, Learned Optimism. It's a beautiful approach to take.
Yeah, I would recommend that book as well.
Enough.
Yes.
It's great stuff. It's really good stuff for us. I loved it. I love that book. I really enjoy his work. And the bizarre thing too, David, it was really strange. I went to a conference where Seligman was speaking, right? And he was talking about optimism, and he said, look, I know there's some pessimists out there. He said, you pessimists, if you've got a question, here's my email address. Send me an email and I'll answer it, right? I'm thinking, he's not going to answer my question. So I went to the conference at lunchtime. I got his email address. I sent him a question by email, right? 2 or 3 minutes later, a response, bang, just like that. Hi, Peter, this is Marty Seligman. I thought, okay, this is cool. And he answered my question. I thought, how cool is that? I thought, who's little old me to get answered by him? But he was just proving his point.
Yeah.
If you think optimistically, you think he's going to answer, and he did.
Wow.
It's bizarre.
Peter, this has been such a wonderful conversation, especially gearing things towards introverts and how we can collaborate and have influence and really bring the power of storytelling into all of this. Where can people find out more about the great work that you're doing?
Well, they can check out my book, Collabradabra, which we talked about earlier, David, The Magic of Collaborative Conversation. It's available anywhere you regularly get books. Or you can check me out at Peter Anthony Consulting. That's my website. And what I'll do, I can send you the link to a couple of videos that I've made on introverts as well, that will help just get you thinking about this space. I am an introvert. I love working with introverts, and it's been absolute delight to have met you, David, and to share these ideas with your listeners. And I genuinely hope that you folks have got some value.
Thank you so much, Peter, and I will put all that information in the show notes. Thanks again for this great conversation.
Absolute pleasure.
Thank you so much for joining me. I look forward to further connecting with you. Reach out at david@quietandstrong.com or check out the quietandstrong.com website, which includes blog posts, links to social media, and other items. Send me topics or guests you would like to see on the show. If you're interested in getting to know yourself better, there's now a free Type Finder personality assessment on the Quiet and Strong website. This free assessment will give you a brief report, including the 4-letter Myers-Briggs code. I'll add a link to the show notes. There's so many great things about being an introvert, so we need those to be understood. Get to know your introverted strengths and needs and be strong.